Dear friends, after a tiring and stressful day, welcome to another mysterious sleeping tale. Tonight, we explore one of America's most haunted places, a place where limestone walls hold memories of pain, redemption, and unimaginable tragedy. We will walk through corridors where footsteps still echo long after quarantine ended, where the living come into contact with the dead, and where history refuses to remain buried. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you to Mansfield, Ohio, to a Gothic castle that was never intended to be a castle, but has transformed into something far more terrifying. This is the story of the Ohio State Correctional Facility, where footsteps continue even after quarantine ended, and some spirits may never leave. Approaching the gates, picture yourself driving through the rolling hills of north-central Ohio on a gray autumn afternoon. The landscape around Mansfield is typical of the American Midwest. Modest homes giving way to farmland, church steeples punctuating small-town skylines, nothing that would prepare you for what waits at 100 Reformatory Road. You turn left off the main route, following signs that seem almost apologetic in their simplicity, and then, rising from behind a gentle slope, you see it. The Ohio State Reformatory doesn't appear gradually. It looms. It announces itself with an architectural violence that stops you mid-breath, a massive structure of pale limestone that seems to have been transplanted from medieval Europe and dropped incongruously into the Ohio countryside. The building doesn't belong here, and it knows it. Every turret, every stone buttress, every Gothic arch seems to scream that this place was built to overwhelm, to intimidate, to remind anyone who approached that they were about to enter a realm governed by different laws than the sunlit world they were leaving behind. The first thing that strikes you about the Reformatory is its sheer size. This isn't a building, it's a fortress. The central administration block rises 6 stories, crowned with a clock tower that once kept time for the men trapped within these walls. Flanking on either side are the east and west cellblocks, themselves massive structures that stretch for what seems like football fields in length. The east cell block, when it was completed in 1908, held the distinction of being the largest freestanding steel cell block in the world, a dubious honor that speaks to the ambitions and perhaps the hubris of its creators. Architect Levi T. Schofield, a Cleveland native who would go on to design several significant buildings in Ohio, including the Athens Lunatic Asylum, conceived the Ohio State Reformatory as something unprecedented in American prison design. He drew inspiration from German castles, from Romanesque fortresses, from Victorian Gothic cathedrals. The result is a building that can't decide what it wants to be. Victorian Gothic elements, elaborate stone carvings, pointed arches, decorative turrets, sit alongside Richardsonian Romanesque features, heavy rustication, rounded arches, massive stone blocks. There are touches of Queen in style in some of the detailing, playful almost, which creates a jarring contrast with the building's overwhelming sense of menace. Schofield's intention, according to historical records, was to create a structure that would inspire inmates to reform their lives. The building was meant to evoke a sense of spirituality, to remind these young men, most of them first-time offenders, that there was something greater than themselves, something worth living for, worth changing for. The architecture was supposed to lift their spirits, to encourage them to turn away from lives of crime and embrace redemption. But standing before the Ohio State Reformatory today, or even in photographs from its operational years, it's hard to see inspiration in these walls. What you see instead is punishment made manifest in stone. This is a building designed to break the human spirit, not lift it. The towers don't inspire, they threaten. The massive walls don't protect, they imprison. And those Gothic arches, those decorative touches that were supposed to evoke cathedrals, they simply remind you that churches and prisons have always been more similar than we like to admit. Both institutions built to reform souls, one through love, the other through fear. The grounds around the Reformatory are largely empty now. When the prison was operational, this 15-acre complex was surrounded by a 25-foot stone wall built by the first inmates who arrived in 1896, their labor serving as the final barrier between themselves and freedom. Beyond that wall were outbuildings, a power plant, workshops where inmates learned trades that were supposed to set them up for success in the outside world. There was an honor farm where better-behaved prisoners could work outdoors, taste something resembling normal life. There was a cemetery, still there actually, where over 200 men who died within these walls were buried in unmarked graves, their names recorded only in prison ledgers that are now yellowing with age. All of those outbuildings are gone now, demolished in the 1990s after the prison closed. The wall is gone too, torn down to make room for the Mansfield Correctional Institution, the modern replacement facility that sits uncomfortably close to its predecessor, close enough that from certain windows in the old Reformatory, you can see the new prison, a reminder that the business of incarceration continues even as this building stands frozen in time. But the main structure remains, and it is impossible to overstate how imposing it is. Even in its current state, partially restored but still showing the scars of abandonment and decay, the Ohio State Reformatory dominates the landscape. It's the kind of building that changes the weather around it, or at least seems to. Clouds seem to gather over it more readily than over the surrounding countryside. Shadows seem deeper, darker. Even on bright summer days, according to visitors, there's something about the Reformatory that seems to drink in light rather than reflect it. Local residents have their own names for the place. Dracula's Castle is the most common, and it's easy to see why. With its Gothic towers silhouetted against the Ohio sky, with its dark stone stained even darker by more than a century of weather, with its hundreds of empty windows staring out like dead eyes, the Reformatory does look like something from a horror film. In fact, it has been used in horror films and in action films, and most famously in one of cinema's most beloved dramas. But we'll get to that. As you approach the main entrance, walking across the parking lot where the outer wall once stood, you can feel the building watching you. This sounds like an exaggeration, like the kind of thing people say to manufacture spookiness where none exists. But speak to anyone who has visited the Ohio State Reformatory, skeptic or believer, and they'll tell you the same thing. The building has presence. It has weight. It seems aware of you in a way that architecture shouldn't be. The entrance to the administration block is marked by a massive rounded arch, Romanesque in style, flanked by columns that seem to have been carved from single pieces of stone. The wooden doors are heavy, original to the building, scarred with the wear of thousands of hands pushing them open over the decades. Above the entrance, carved into the stonework, you can still make out decorative elements that were supposed to inspire crosses, architectural flourishes that suggest church windows, symbols that were meant to remind inmates that this was a place of reform, not just punishment. But any sense of welcome those symbols might have once conveyed is undermined by what surrounds them. The walls here are thick, 3 feet or more in some places, built from limestone quarried locally and brought here by rail. The windows, even at the entrance, are small and high, designed to let in just enough light to see but not enough to feel human. And everywhere you look, there are bars. Not visible from the front, perhaps, but you know they're there. You can sense them. This is a building designed to keep people in, and it excels at that purpose even now, decades after the last prisoner walked out its doors. Stepping through those front doors, whether you're visiting on a guided tour or attending one of the overnight paranormal investigations that the Reformatory now hosts, is like stepping backward in time. The interior of the administration block has been partially restored by the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society, the nonprofit organization that saved this building from demolition in 1995. But restoration here doesn't mean modernization. It means stripping away some of the decay while preserving the essential character of the place, which is to say, its darkness, its sense of weight, its atmosphere of accumulated sorrow. The central hallway of the administration block is wide, designed to accommodate groups of guards and inmates moving through the building. The floors are worn smooth by countless feet. The walls are painted in institutional colors that might have been cream or pale yellow once, but are now faded to something indefinable, something between gray and beige and the color of old bones. Wooden staircases lead up to the upper floors, each step creaking with age, the handrails smooth from decades of hands gripping them. The architecture here, inside, is more refined than you might expect in a prison. There are decorative moldings, carved wooden details, touches that speak to the ambitions of the original builders, their belief that environment could shape character, that beauty could inspire reform. In the offices where superintendents once worked, where guards planned their shifts, where paperwork tracked the lives of thousands of men, you can still see evidence of this aspirational design. High ceilings to make rooms feel grand rather than cramped. Large windows, though barred, to let in natural light. Built-in bookshelves and ornate light fixtures that wouldn't look out of place in a prosperous home of the era. But all of this architectural ambition, all of these attempts to make the Reformatory something more than just another prison, they're overshadowed by what you can feel rather than see. There's a heaviness in the air here, a sense that the walls themselves are saturated with memory. Not pleasant memory, not the kind of echoes you'd find in an old house where generations of families lived and loved and laughed. These walls remember fear. They remember violence. They remember despair so profound that some men chose to end their lives rather than continue existing within these confines. If you stand still in the central hallway of the administration block, if you close your eyes and really listen, you can hear the building breathing. That sounds like metaphor, but visitors report it constantly. A sense of respiration, of something vast and alive exhaling around you. Maybe it's just the wind moving through the structure, through the broken windows and the gaps in the walls that no amount of restoration can fully seal. Maybe it's the building settling, old materials contracting and expanding with temperature changes, creating sounds that our pattern-seeking brains interpret as something more than physics. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe after 94 years of operation, after housing 154,000 inmates over its lifetime, after witnessing more than 200 deaths within its walls, the Ohio State Reformatory absorbed something. Maybe buildings, especially buildings made of limestone and steel and wood, materials that came from living things or from the deep earth. Maybe these buildings can hold memory the way magnetic tape holds sound. Maybe in a place where emotions ran as high as they did here, where fear and rage and sorrow were constants, Those feelings soaked into the very structure. And what we sense when we walk these halls isn't ghosts in the traditional sense, but the building itself replaying what it recorded. That's the scientific explanation, the one that lets us sleep at night. But standing in the Ohio State Reformatory, feeling its weight pressing down on you, sensing eyes on your back even when you're alone in a hallway, hearing sounds that have no source, smelling scents that have no origin, the scientific explanation starts to feel inadequate. This place is haunted, whether by ghosts or by memory, by the dead, or simply by the accumulated psychic residue of human suffering. The Ohio State Reformatory is haunted in ways that challenge our comfortable assumptions about how the world works. And we haven't even left the entrance yet. From the administration block, corridors lead to the two massive cell blocks, east and west, where the real business of the prison took place. But before we venture into those steel and concrete caverns, before we confront the tiny cells where men lived for months or years, before we stand in the spaces where violence was commonplace and death was always near, we need to understand how this place came to be. We need to understand the history behind these haunted walls, because the hauntings make sense only when you know the history, when you understand what happened here, what was done to men within these walls, and what some men did to each other. The Ohio State Reformatory wasn't meant to be a house of horrors. It was meant to be something better, something hopeful. But somewhere along the way, between the idealistic vision of its founders and the grim reality of its final years, something went terribly wrong. And to understand what went wrong, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when the site was nothing but an open field, to a moment when this place still held promise rather than prisoners. The history behind the walls. Long before the Ohio State Reformatory rose from the earth like a Gothic nightmare made solid, the land on which it stands held a different kind of institution, one that was also concerned with young men and discipline and preparing them for a harsh world. This history matters because some believe that the site was troubled long before the first stone of the reformatory was laid, that the ground itself absorbed violence and tragedy that would echo through the decades to come. In 1861, with the Civil War newly begun and the Union scrambling to train soldiers for a conflict that would ultimately claim over 600,000 lives, an open field just outside Mansfield, Ohio, was selected as the site for a military training camp. The camp was named Camp Mordecai Bartley, honoring Mordecai Bartley, a Mansfield resident who had served as Ohio's governor in the 1840s. From the spring of 1861 through the early months of the war, young men from across northern Ohio reported to this camp for drilling and training. The camp was operational for only a few months before the training shifted to other locations, but in that brief time, the field saw its share of hardship. Training for war is never easy, and conditions in Civil War training camps were notoriously difficult. Poor sanitation, inadequate medical care, harsh discipline, these were constants. Men died in training camps from disease, from accidents, sometimes from the brutal hazing that was considered normal in military culture of the time. We don't have detailed records of deaths at Camp Mordecai Bartley specifically, but we know that every major training camp of the era lost men before they ever saw battle. And according to some paranormal researchers who have investigated the reformatory, this matters. They claim that some of the earliest documented paranormal experiences at the site, reports that predate the construction of the reformatory itself, can be traced to the Civil War era. Soldiers reported seeing figures moving through the camp at night, figures that disappeared when approached. There were stories of cold spots, of feelings of dread in certain areas, of sounds like musket fire echoing across the field when no one was drilling. Are these stories true? Were they embellished over the years, growing more dramatic with each retelling? It's impossible to know. What we can say with certainty is that by the time the Civil War ended, the training camp had closed and the field had returned to civilian use. And that's where it might have stayed, an unremarkable piece of land outside an unremarkable Ohio town, if not for the fact that American society in the late 19th century was grappling with a new problem, or rather, an old problem that had grown too large to ignore. The problem was crime, specifically juvenile crime and the crimes of young men. The traditional prison system of the era wasn't designed to handle young offenders. Boys and young men who committed crimes were sent to the same prisons as hardened adult criminals, where they were as likely to be victimized as reformed. Reformers began arguing for a new kind of institution, something between a juvenile detention center and an adult penitentiary, a place designed specifically for first-time offenders aged roughly 16 to 30, young men who had made mistakes, but who, with the right guidance, might still be salvaged. Ohio was one of the early adopters of this reformatory model. The state already had the Boys Industrial School in Lancaster for younger offenders and the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus for hardened criminals. What was needed, reformers argued, was something in between, an intermediate penitentiary that could take young men who were too old for juvenile facilities, but whose crimes weren't serious enough to warrant life sentences among truly dangerous convicts. In 1867, Mansfield was proposed as the site for this new facility. The city was eager to secure the institution, seeing it as a source of employment and economic activity. Local businessmen and civic leaders raised $10,000, a substantial sum for the time, to purchase 30 acres of land. The state added another 150 acres for a total of 180 acres, paying $20,000 for the additional property. The site selected was the old camp Mordecai Bartley Field, the same location where young men had trained for war just a few years earlier. But selecting a site and actually building a massive prison are two very different things. The proposed intermediate penitentiary, which would later be renamed the Ohio State Reformatory, faced immediate challenges. The most significant was funding. The state legislature approved the project and allocated initial construction funds, but the money was never enough. Construction would begin, then halt when funds ran out, then resume when more appropriations came through, then halt again. This pattern would continue for over 2 decades. Ground was officially broken on November 4th, 1886. Architect Levi T. Schofield presented his ambitious design, a massive structure that would combine multiple architectural styles to create something that was meant to be both imposing and inspiring. Schofield's vision called for using locally quarried limestone for the exterior walls, steel and concrete for the cell blocks, and elaborate architectural details that would make this prison unlike any other in the country. The cornerstone was laid with appropriate ceremony. Local dignitaries gave speeches about rehabilitation and redemption, about how this facility would serve as a model for enlightened penology, about how young men who entered these walls as criminals would leave as productive citizens. The speeches were optimistic, idealistic, full of the progressive spirit that characterized much of late 19th century reform movements. But actually constructing the reformatory proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The initial appropriation covered only a fraction of what would be needed. Construction crews would work for months, then be sent home when funds ran out. Building materials would be delivered, then sit exposed to the weather while legislators debated additional appropriations. The project became something of a joke in Ohio political circles, the prison that would never be finished, the white elephant slowly rising outside Mansfield. Despite these setbacks, construction proceeded. The West Cell Block was prioritized, the thinking being that the Reformatory could begin accepting inmates, even if the entire facility wasn't complete. The West Cell Block was designed to be 5 tiers high, with 360 cells, most of them designed to hold 2 men, though some of the larger cells could accommodate 4. The cells were small by any standard, roughly 7 feet by 9 feet, but compared to many prisons of the era, they were almost generous. Each cell was supposed to have its own toilet and sink, an unusual feature for the time, reflecting the Reformatory's rehabilitative mission. By September 1896, the West Cell Block was complete enough to accept prisoners. On September 17th of that year, 150 men were transferred from the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus to the new Ohio State Reformatory, the name having been officially changed from Intermediate Penitentiary to better reflect the facility's mission. These first inmates ranged in age from 16 to 30, and most were first-time offenders convicted of nonviolent crimes. They had been selected carefully, the ideal candidates for the Reformatory's rehabilitative approach, and they were put to work immediately. The Reformatory wasn't finished, far from it. The sewer system still needed to be completed. The 25-foot stone wall that would eventually surround the entire 15-acre complex hadn't been built. Outbuildings were needed. So the first inmates, working under guard supervision, became construction workers, finishing the prison that would hold them. There's something deeply ironic about this. These young men, sent to the Reformatory to be reformed, to be taught trades and given education and shown a better path, their first lesson was that they would build their own cage. They dug trenches for sewer lines. They hauled stones for the wall. They mixed mortar and laid bricks. And they did this knowing that every stone they placed, every section of wall they completed, made their own escape more difficult. But the work gave them something, gave them purpose, gave them a sense of accomplishment, even if that accomplishment was their own imprisonment. And in those early years, there are accounts suggesting that morale among inmates was relatively good. The guards weren't brutal. The food was adequate. The mission of reform was taken seriously. Inmates attended religious services every Sunday. These were mandatory, not optional. They attended classes, working toward basic literacy if they lacked it, learning arithmetic, reading history, and civics. And they learned trades, carpentry, masonry, blacksmithing, skills they could use on the outside. The reformatory model, in those early years, seemed to work. Inmates who showed progress after 18 months were paroled. Those who didn't received another 18-month term. The recidivism rate, the percentage of men who committed new crimes after release, was lower than at traditional prisons. Superintendents wrote optimistic reports about the success of the rehabilitative approach. Former inmates occasionally returned to the reformatory to thank the staff, to show them that they'd turned their lives around. But even in those early years, there were cracks in the idealistic vision. Construction continued, slowly, frustratingly slowly. The East Cell Block wasn't completed until 1908, 12 years after the reformatory opened, 22 years after construction began. The East Cell Block was even larger than the West, 6 tiers high with 600 cells, designed to hold about 1,200 men. Together, the 2 cell blocks gave the reformatory a maximum capacity of roughly 1,900 inmates, though that number assumed one man per cell in most cases. As the reformatory grew, so did its population. And as its population grew, the nature of that population began to change. More serious offenders were being sent to Mansfield. Men with violent histories, men with multiple convictions, men who weren't first-time offenders at all, but were being transferred from other facilities that were overcrowded. The intermediate nature of the reformatory, that careful positioning between juvenile facility and adult penitentiary, began to blur. By the 1920s, the Ohio State Reformatory was no longer housing primarily young first-time offenders. It was becoming a general-purpose medium-security prison, and the decade brought new challenges. Prohibition, which went into effect in 1920, led to an explosion in crime. Bootleggers, smugglers, and gangsters swelled prison populations across the country. Ohio's prison system, already strained, began to buckle under the pressure. Cells designed for one man now held two. Cells designed for two now held three or sometimes four. Then came 1930, and an event that would change the Ohio State Reformatory forever, turning it from a troubled but still somewhat idealistic institution into something far darker. On April 21st, 1930, a fire broke out at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. What started as a small blaze, probably caused by faulty wiring or a discarded cigarette, quickly spread through the wooden roof structures and down into the cell blocks. The prison's fire suppression systems were inadequate. The guards, faced with an impossible choice, keep the cells locked to prevent escape or unlock them and risk being overrun, chose to keep the cells locked. The fire killed 320 men. They died of smoke inhalation, of burns, trapped in their cells while the inferno raged around them. Prisoners who survived described the sound of men screaming, the smell of burning flesh, the hopeless pounding of fists against locked cell doors. It was one of the worst prison disasters in American history, and it sent shockwaves through Ohio's entire correction system. The surviving prisoners, more than 600 men, had to be relocated immediately. Every prison in the state took some. The Ohio State Reformatory received approximately 200 to 266 prisoners. Accounts vary from the Columbus Penitentiary. These weren't young first-time offenders. These were hardened criminals, murderers, rapists, men serving life sentences, men who had survived a literal hell and who carried that trauma with them. They were housed initially in the West Attic, an unfinished space that had been intended for storage, not human habitation. The attic had no windows, no ventilation, a single door. In the summer heat of an Ohio June, the temperature in that space must have been unbearable. The men slept on the floor, on whatever bedding could be scavenged. And they bore the physical scars of the fire, burns covering their bodies, injuries that required medical attention the reformatory's small infirmary was ill-equipped to provide. Infections were common. Some men died not from their burns, but from the infections that followed, from pneumonia that developed in the unsanitary conditions of the attic. If you visit the Ohio State Reformatory today, you can go up to the West Attic. It's part of some of the tours, particularly the paranormal tours. And you can still see, scratched into the walls, the signatures of some of those men who were housed there in 1930. Names and dates, desperate carvings made by men who wanted to leave some record of their existence, some proof that they had survived one hell only to find themselves in another. The arrival of these hardened criminals from Columbus fundamentally changed the character of the reformatory. The young men who were supposed to be there for rehabilitation found themselves sharing space with murderers. The guards who had been trained in rehabilitative techniques found themselves having to adopt a more confrontational, more violent approach to maintain order. The reformatory's mission, already strained by overcrowding, essentially ended. What remained was just another prison, more crowded and more violent than most. Through the 1930s and 1940s, conditions at the Ohio State Reformatory deteriorated steadily. There were riots, some small, some large. There were escapes, or at least attempts. There were murders, inmates killing other inmates, guards dying in the line of duty. The Reformatory developed a reputation as one of the toughest prisons in Ohio, a far cry from its idealistic origins. And all of this was happening in a building that was already showing its age. The limestone exterior might look imposing, but limestone is porous. It absorbs water, it cracks in freeze-thaw cycles. The steel in the cell blocks was rusting. The plumbing, already overtaxed by too many men, frequently failed. Rats and other vermin were constant problems. Disease spread through the overcrowded cell blocks with depressing regularity. By 1960, the state had given up any pretense that this was a reformatory. It was officially redesignated as a maximum security prison. The educational programs that had once been so important were cut or eliminated. The vocational training continued, but mostly because the prison needed the labor. The religious services remained mandatory, but fewer and fewer men paid attention. The mission of reform was dead. What remained was warehousing, keeping dangerous men off the streets for as long as the law allowed. Then came the final, grinding decades. The 1970s brought a wave of lawsuits against prisons across the country. Inmates arguing that conditions constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. The Ohio State Reformatory was hit with one of these suits in 1978. Inmates detailed the conditions: 3 men in cells designed for 1, toilets that didn't work, medical care that was virtually non-existent, violence that was rampant and largely unchecked by guards who were themselves understaffed and underpaid. In 1983, a federal judge agreed with the inmates. The Ohio State Reformatory was declared unconstitutional. The judge ordered it closed, giving the state 3 years to build a replacement facility and transfer all inmates. But bureaucracy moved slowly. 3 years became 5, then 7. It wasn't until September 1990 that the Mansfield Correctional Institution, the modern replacement facility built on land that had once been part of the reformatory's grounds, was completed. On December 31st, 1990, the last inmates were transferred out of the Ohio State Reformatory. The last guards turned off the lights and locked the doors. The reformatory stood empty after that, abandoned but not forgotten. The state wanted to demolish it, to remove this embarrassing relic of failed rehabilitation and make room for expansion of a new prison. Wrecking crews were hired. Demolition was scheduled to begin in 1993, but then something unexpected happened. Something that would not only save the Ohio State Reformatory from demolition, but would ensure that people from around the world would know its name, would walk its halls, would stand in the very cells where men once lived and sometimes died. Hollywood came calling. A director looking for the perfect location for a film adaptation of a Stephen King story took one look at the reformatory's Gothic exterior and knew he'd found his Shawshank State Prison. But before we talk about the movie that saved the reformatory, before we discuss its current incarnation as a historic site and paranormal tourism destination, we need to explore the specific spaces within these walls, The rooms and corridors and cells where the most intense experiences occurred, where lives were lived and ended, where the past seems closest to breaking through into the present. We need to walk through the warden's quarters, where tragedy struck a family. We need to descend into the cell blocks, where most of the reformatory's ghosts seem to linger. And we need to venture into the dark places, the basement, and the hole in the chair room, where even skeptics report feeling something wrong, something that shouldn't be there. This is where the history becomes personal, where the statistics and the dates and the bureaucratic language of court orders and state budgets give way to individual stories, individual sorrows, individual hauntings. This is where the Ohio State Reformatory reveals its true nature, not as a building, but as a repository of human suffering, a place where the membrane between past and present has worn thin. The warden's quarters. If you enter the Ohio State Reformatory through the main entrance and walk up the grand staircase in the administration block, your steps echoing off walls that have absorbed decades of similar sounds, you'll come to the second floor. Here, set apart from the offices and meeting rooms that comprise the working heart of the prison's administration, you'll find a series of rooms that seem almost incongruous in a prison setting. Rooms with higher ceilings than necessary, with windows that actually allow sunlight to stream in, with decorative moldings and built-in bookshelves and other touches that speak to domestic life rather than institutional function. These are the warden's quarters, the apartment where several of the reformatory superintendents lived with their families, raising children within earshot of locked cell doors, hosting dinner parties while guards patrolled the corridors below. The practice of having prison wardens live on-site was common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The thinking was practical. If something went wrong in the middle of the night, a riot or a fire or an escape attempt, the warden needed to be immediately available. But it was also symbolic. The warden's family living within the prison walls was supposed to demonstrate confidence in the security of the facility, to show that this was a controlled environment, safe enough for women and children. For the families who actually lived in these quarters, the reality was more complicated. Yes, the apartments were spacious and well appointed by the standards of the time. Yes, the warden's position came with prestige and a decent salary. But the emotional weight of living in a prison, of hearing the sounds of confinement every day, of knowing that just one floor below, hundreds or thousands of men were locked in tiny cells, that weight took its toll. Several wardens and superintendents lived in these quarters over the decades, but one family story has become inextricably linked with the reformatory's haunted reputation. That family was the Glattks, Arthur and Helen, and their 2 sons. And what happened to them, particularly to Helen, remains one of the most tragic and most discussed aspects of the Ohio State Reformatory's history. Arthur Glattke was appointed superintendent of the Ohio State Reformatory in 1935. He was a political appointee, as were most high-level prison administrators of the era, but by all accounts, he took the job seriously. He implemented reforms that improved conditions for inmates, at least to the extent that overcrowding and limited budgets allowed. He had the respect of his staff and, according to contemporary reports, even the respect of many inmates. He was firm but fair. The accounts say a man who believed in discipline, but also in giving men a chance to prove themselves. He brought his family to the warden's quarters, his wife Helen and their 2 sons. Helen Bauer Glattke, born in 1909, was by all accounts a devoted wife and mother. She was religious, attending Mass regularly at the local Catholic church. She was known for her kindness, for making homemade perfume with a distinctive rose scent, for hosting small gatherings in the apartment, even though the surroundings were far from normal. The Glattke boys grew up in the Reformatory. They played in the halls of the administration block. They knew the guards by name. They were accustomed to the sounds of the prison, the echoing footsteps, the clang of cell doors, the distant shouts and conversations of inmates. It was their normal, as strange as that normal might seem to outsiders. For 15 years, the Glattkes lived in the Warden's quarters. Arthur managed the Reformatory through some of its most difficult years, the period when the influx of hardened criminals from the Columbus fire was fundamentally changing the character of the institution. He dealt with overcrowding, with violence, with a constant struggle to maintain order with limited resources. It was stressful, exhausting work, but he seemed to handle it with equanimity. Then came Sunday morning, November 5th, 1950. The family was preparing for church, as they did every Sunday. Helen went into the closet in the master bedroom to retrieve her hat box. She wanted a particular hat for Massachusetts. The closet had shelves, and on one of the upper shelves, Arthur had placed his service revolver, a .32 caliber pistol that he kept for security purposes. What happened next is a matter of official record, though the details are disputed. According to the most widely accepted account, Helen reached past the pistol to get to the hat box. In doing so, she apparently knocked the gun off the shelf. It fell to the floor and discharged when it hit, the bullet striking Helen in the chest. Arthur heard the shot and rushed into the bedroom. Helen was conscious, bleeding, in shock. He called for an ambulance immediately. She was taken to Mansfield General Hospital, just a few minutes away. The doctors worked on her, but the bullet had done terrible damage. It had perforated her spleen, torn through her left diaphragm, punctured her right lung at its apex, and grazed her heart and pericardium. She held on for 3 days, but ultimately developed pulmonary edema, fluid filling her lungs, and died on November 7th, 1950. The death certificate lists the cause of death as pulmonary edema, 12 hours, antecedent cause. Gunshot wound, left chest, perforation of spleen, left diaphragm, right lung apex, heart, pericardium, 43 hours. Manner, accidental discharge of automatic pistol. That's the official story. An accident. Un terrible, tragique accident. But from the beginning, there were whispers. Prison is a gossipy place, and rumors spread quickly among both staff and inmates. Some said it wasn't an accident at all. Some said Helen had discovered that Arthur was having an affair with a staff member and that she was planning to divorce him, which in 1950s Ohio, especially for a prominent Catholic family, would have been scandalous. The affair story claimed that Helen had shot herself in despair, or that Arthur had shot her to prevent a public divorce, staging it to look like an accident. Others whispered darker theories. That an inmate had somehow gotten access to the gun and shot Helen, perhaps as revenge against Arthur for some punishment. That there had been an argument, a struggle, and the gun had gone off in the confrontation. There's no evidence for any of these alternative theories. No police investigation suggested anything other than an accident. No witnesses came forward claiming to have seen or heard anything suspicious. Arthur was never considered a suspect. His grief in the weeks and months following Helen's death was, by all accounts, genuine and profound. But the rumors persist, fed in part by the subsequent paranormal reports from the warden's quarters. Because Helen's death was just the beginning of the tragedy for the Glattke family. Arthur continued as superintendent for 9 more years after Helen's death. He never remarried. He threw himself into his work, but those who knew him said he was changed, quieter, more withdrawn. He still lived in the warden's quarters, still slept in the bedroom where Helen had been shot, still walked past the closet every day. His sons had graduated from high school and moved away by this point, so Arthur was alone in the apartment, alone with his memories and his grief. On March 9th, 1959, Arthur Glattke suffered a massive heart attack in his office on the first floor of the administration block. Guards called for an ambulance, but Arthur died before it arrived. He was 64 years old. The official cause of death was heart failure, but everyone who knew him believed that the stress of running the Reformatory, combined with the sorrow of losing Helen, had killed him just as surely as a bullet. The Glattke sons, now adults, were left orphaned, their mother dead of a gunshot wound, their father dead of a broken heart. Theodore Glattke, the younger son, has in recent years spoken out about how he feels the Reformatory has exploited his parents' deaths, turning personal tragedy into ghost tour fodder. He has said publicly that he doesn't believe in the hauntings, that he thinks the paranormal stories are disrespectful to his parents' memory, that he wishes people would remember Arthur and Helen as real people who lived real lives rather than as the stars of ghost stories. But the hauntings, if that's what they are, were reported long before the Reformatory became a tourist attraction. Inmates, while the prison was still operational, reported strange occurrences in the administration block, particularly at night. Several claimed to have seen a woman in old-fashioned dress walking the corridors of the second floor, particularly near what had been the warden's quarters. These reports date back to the 1950s, shortly after Helen's death, long before anyone was deliberately looking for ghosts. The most consistent reported phenomenon associated with Helen is the smell of roses. Her homemade rosewater perfume was distinctive, and multiple people over the decades have reported smelling roses in the warden's quarters, particularly in the master bedroom, and in what's now called the pink bathroom, Helen's personal bathroom. The smell comes suddenly, with no apparent source, fills a room, then fades. It's strongest, according to those who experience it, near the closet where the gun fell. During paranormal investigations, when electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, recordings are made in the warden's quarters, voices have allegedly been captured. A woman's voice saying things like, "I'm not dead," or "Why won't he listen?" or calling out names. One particularly eerie EVP supposedly captured a woman's voice saying "Arthur" in a tone that sounds questioning, almost pleading. Visual sightings are rarer, but not unheard of. Several visitors over the years have reported seeing a woman in the master bedroom, usually dressed in dark clothing from the 1950s era. She's typically described as appearing distressed, sometimes holding her chest, sometimes reaching toward the closet. The figure is usually translucent but clearly visible, and typically disappears when approached or when the witness blinks or looks away. There are also reports of phantom sounds. The piano in the family's living area, which is still present, allegedly plays notes when no one is near it. Doors open and close on their own. Footsteps are heard pacing the corridors. And on rare occasions, visitors report hearing what sounds like an argument, raised voices, though no words can be made out clearly. Arthur's spirit is also said to linger. The scent of cherry pipe tobacco, which Arthur favored, is occasionally reported in the warden's office on the first floor and in the quarters. Some paranormal investigators claim to have captured Arthur's voice on EVP, typically single words or short phrases. And there are reports of a man's figure being seen in the office, always at the desk where Arthur worked, always sitting, sometimes with his head in his hands. What's interesting about the Glattke hauntings, if we accept for the moment that they're real, is that they seem to be intelligent hauntings rather than residual ones. In paranormal terminology, a residual haunting is like a recording, the same events replaying over and over without awareness or interaction. An intelligent haunting involves entities that seem aware of the present, that respond to questions or stimuli, that interact with the living. The reports from the warden's quarters suggest intelligence. Helen's spirit, if that's what it is, seems to communicate, to try to make contact. She chooses when to manifest her perfume or her presence. She responds, allegedly, to direct questions during paranormal investigations. This suggests, if we believe the reports, that she's not just a memory imprinted on the building, but something more, something that has awareness and perhaps unfinished business. What that unfinished business might be is a matter of speculation. Some paranormal researchers believe Helen is trying to communicate the truth about her death, that the official account of an accident isn't complete, that there's something more she wants people to know. Others think she simply can't leave, that she's tied to this place where she lived with her family, where her life ended suddenly and violently, where she left behind a husband and sons who still needed her. There's also speculation about why both Helen and Arthur would haunt the Reformatory rather than following their sons or attaching to some other location. One theory is that the intensity of emotion in the Reformatory, the accumulated suffering of thousands of inmates over decades, creates a kind of psychic gravity that traps spirits. Another theory is simpler. This was their home. For 15 years before Helen's death, and for 9 years after for Arthur, this building was where they lived their lives, where they raised their children, where they experienced joy and sorrow and all the mundane moments that make up a life. Maybe in death, they simply came home. The warden's quarters have been extensively restored by the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society. The rooms look much as they would have in the Glattke era, though the furniture isn't original. The master bedroom is particularly striking, with period-appropriate furnishings and Helen's pink bathroom visible through an open door. Standing in that bedroom, looking at the closet, it's impossible not to imagine that November morning in 1950, to picture Helen reaching for her hat, to hear in your mind the sharp report of the pistol, to feel the sudden transformation from a normal Sunday morning to tragedy. Skeptics will point out that knowing this history colors our experience of the space. We expect to feel something, so we interpret any unusual sensation, any strange smell, any unexplained sound as evidence of haunting. This is almost certainly true to some extent. The power of suggestion is real and well documented. If you're told a room is haunted, if you know the tragic history, you're primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli as paranormal. But the sheer consistency of reports over decades, from people who often didn't know the full history, from skeptics as well as believers, from prison staff who had no interest in ghost stories, these reports are harder to dismiss. Something is happening in the warden's quarters. Whether it's ghosts or psychology or something else entirely, people experience phenomena there that they can't easily explain. And Helen and Arthur's story, tragic as it is, represents just one small part of the Ohio State Reformatory's haunted history. Their tragedy was personal, contained within one family. But the tragedies that occurred in the Cellblocks, where thousands of men lived in conditions that deteriorated from difficult to inhumane, where violence was a constant threat, where some men chose death over continued existence, those tragedies were on a scale that defies easy comprehension. And that's where we need to go next, into the steel and concrete caverns where most of the Reformatory's ghosts are said to reside, where the air itself seems heavy with memory, where even the most hardened skeptics report feeling watched, feeling unwelcome, feeling the presence of something that resents their intrusion. The cell blocks await, and they are not kind to visitors. The cell blocks. From the administration block, access to the cell blocks is through a central guard room, a high-ceilinged space where corrections officers once monitored the comings and goings between the administrative side of the prison and the residential side. This room, sometimes called the rotunda or the hub, was the literal and figurative center of the Ohio State Reformatory. From here, guards could see down corridors leading to both the east and west cell blocks. From here, they controlled access, checked paperwork, responded to emergencies. Standing in this guard room today, you can feel the weight of its purpose. This was a choke point, a place where authority was concentrated. Every inmate who moved from his cell to the dining hall, to classes, to the workshops, to the chapel, passed through this space. Every inmate was observed here, assessed, his behavior noted. This was panopticon architecture at its finest, the guards seeing all while remaining partially obscure behind their barriers. But step beyond the guard room, pass through the doorway into one of the cell blocks, and you enter a different world entirely. A world of steel and echoes, a vertical space that seems designed to make human beings feel small and powerless. A world where light comes reluctantly, filtered through small windows high above, never quite reaching the lower tiers, leaving everything in a perpetual twilight. Let's start with the west cell block, the older of the two, the one that opened first in 1896. The moment you step into this space, assuming you're visiting during the day with at least some natural light filtering in, your breath catches. The scale is overwhelming. The cell block is 5 tiers tall, each tier consisting of a metal walkway lined with cell doors. The tiers are stacked vertically, connected by metal staircases that zigzag up the height of the building. And it's tall, far taller than 5 stories should be. The ceilings are high, creating a sense of vast empty space above the top tier. The cells themselves line both sides of each tier, creating a central aisle. Each cell is roughly 7 feet by 9 feet, though some are slightly larger. Each has a barred door facing the central aisle and a small window at the back, though most windows are now broken or missing entirely. The cells on the outer wall of the building have actual exterior windows, small and high, but at least offering some connection to the outside world. The cells on the interior wall have only the small openings for ventilation, no daylight at all. Standing on the ground floor of the west cell block and looking up, the tiers above seem to stretch toward infinity. The metal walkways create geometric patterns, bars upon bars upon bars, a labyrinth of steel. The acoustics are strange. Sounds echo in ways that make it difficult to pinpoint their origin. A footstep on the 5th tier can sound like it's right next to you on the ground floor. A voice from one end of the cell block carries to the other, bouncing off the steel and concrete until words become indistinguishable murmurs. This acoustic property, which makes the cell block feel alive with phantom sounds, wasn't accidental. It was a form of control. Inmates could never have private conversations. Everything they said could potentially be heard by guards or by other inmates dozens of yards away. The inability to speak without being overheard was a constant reminder that privacy didn't exist, that they were always monitored, always observed, always under control. The east cell block is even more imposing. Completed in 1908, it's 6 tiers tall, making it at one point the largest freestanding steel cell block in the world. The cells are roughly the same size as in the West, but there are more of them, approximately 600 compared to the West's 360. The East cell block was designed to hold about 1,200 men, assuming most cells held 2 inmates. But designed to hold, and actually held, diverged dramatically over the decades. By the 1930s, after the influx of prisoners from the Columbus fire, cells designed for 1 man regularly held 2 or 3. By the 1950s and 60s, as prison populations across the country exploded, cells in the East cell block sometimes held 4 men. 4 men in a 7x9 space. Think about that for a moment. Try to imagine 4 adult men living in a space not much bigger than a walk-in closet, with 1 toilet, 1 sink, and no privacy whatsoever. The psychological effects of this overcrowding were predictable and brutal. Men who might have been able to serve their sentences without incident in better conditions were driven to violence or to madness by the sheer impossibility of their circumstances. Fights broke out constantly. Sometimes they were over territory, who controlled which part of cell. Sometimes they were over personal slights, real or imagined. Sometimes they erupted for no reason anyone could identify, just the spontaneous combustion of rage that comes from being caged in intolerable conditions. The cell blocks saw dozens of deaths over the decades. Some were from natural causes, men dying of disease, of heart attacks, of conditions that went untreated or undertreated by the prison's overwhelmed medical staff. Some were murders, men beaten or stabbed by cellmates or by enemies in other cells. And some were suicides, men who decided that death was preferable to continuing in these conditions, who hanged themselves from cell bars or cut their wrists with smuggled sharp objects, or, in a few horrific cases, set themselves on fire. The most frequently cited suicide in paranormal discussions of the Reformatory is that of James Lockhart. Lockhart was an inmate in the East cell block, and according to accounts that have become part of the Reformatory's ghost lore, he was being severely bullied by other inmates. The bullying, which may have had sexual overtones, reached a point where Lockhart felt he had no way out. He knew that reporting the bullying to guards would likely result in retaliation that would be even worse. He knew that his sentence stretched far enough into the future that escape through legal means wasn't imminent. So one night, Lockhart set himself on fire in his cell. He used whatever accelerant he could obtain, probably smuggled lighter fluid or a similar substance, soaked his clothing, and lit it. The fire killed him, but not quickly. By the time guards reached his cell and extinguished the flames, Lockhart had suffered burns over most of his body. He lingered for hours before dying. Paranormal investigators who have studied the East cell block claim that Lockhart's spirit is still present. They report cold spots in and around the cell where he died, a cell whose location is documented in prison records but not marked for visitors. They claim to have captured EVPs of a man screaming, of someone crying out for help. During investigations, when participants specifically call out Lockhart's name and ask him to make his presence known, equipment reportedly malfunctions, batteries drain suddenly, and people feel intense heat, as if reliving the moment of the fire. Lockhart's death wasn't unique. Another documented suicide in the East cell block was Larry Hamer, an inmate who hanged himself just 1 week before he was scheduled to be transferred to a different facility. No one knows why Hamer chose to end his life when release from the Reformatory was so close. Maybe the transfer was to a worse facility. Maybe he simply couldn't endure 1 more week. His death, like so many others in the Reformatory, remains a mystery, a final act of desperation that no one living can fully understand. The cell blocks, both east and west, are consistently described by visitors as the most oppressive parts of the Reformatory. Even on bright sunny days, even with tour groups moving through and voices echoing in flashlights cutting through the dimness, there's an undeniable heaviness to these spaces. The air feels thick, harder to breathe than it should be. The temperature seems to fluctuate without reason, spots of intense cold in the middle of otherwise ambient conditions, or occasionally spots of uncomfortable heat. Many visitors report feeling watched in the cell blocks, particularly when they're on the upper tiers. The sensation is distinct and unsettling, the feeling of eyes on your back, of someone just out of sight observing your movements. It's easy to dismiss this as paranoia, as a natural response to being in an unfamiliar and intimidating environment. But the consistency of these reports, the fact that people feel watched in specific locations within the cell blocks, gives skeptics pause. The most commonly reported location for this sensation is the 5th tier of the west cell block and the 6th tier of the east. These uppermost levels, closest to the ceiling, farthest from the ground floor, seem to have a particular concentration of unexplained phenomena. Shadows are seen moving along the walkways when no one is there. Footsteps echo on the metal floors, distinct and unhurried, stopping when you try to track them down. Cell doors that are slightly ajar swing shut with a clang that echoes through the entire cell block, even though there's no wind, no vibration, nothing to cause the movement. Some of the most chilling reports from the cell blocks come from photographs. Digital cameras, which rely on electronic sensors to capture light, occasionally capture things in the cell blocks that the human eye didn't see. Orbs of light, which skeptics rightly point out are usually just dust particles or lens flares, appear in unusually high concentrations in certain cells. Shadow figures, human-shaped but indistinct, show up in doorways or on walkways. Faces or things that look like faces peer out from cells that were empty when the photo was taken. The skeptical explanation for these photographic anomalies is straightforward. The cell blocks are dusty, poorly lit, full of reflective surfaces. Cameras pick up all sorts of visual artifacts in these conditions, and the human brain, which is wired to find patterns, especially faces, interprets these artifacts as paranormal. This explanation is almost certainly correct for the vast majority of anomalous photos taken at the Reformatory, but not all of them. Some photographs show figures with such clarity, such definition, that dust and lens flares don't seem adequate to explain them. Some show multiple figures in the same frame, all with similar characteristics, suggesting something beyond random artifacts. And some photographs, taken in sequence just seconds apart, show dramatic changes. A cell that was empty in one frame has a visible figure in the next, then is empty again in the third. Are these proof of ghosts? No. Photography alone can never prove the paranormal because there are too many variables, too many ways images can be manipulated or misinterpreted. But the photographs, combined with the personal experiences of visitors, combined with the documented history of violence and death in the cell blocks, create a compelling circumstantial case that something unusual is happening in these spaces. One particularly disturbing phenomenon reported in the East Cell Block is the sound of snoring. Multiple visitors, including some who were skeptics before their visit, report hearing what sounds like someone snoring in the cells. The sound is distinct, rhythmic, unmistakably human, unmistakably the sound of someone sleeping. But when the visitor approaches the cell where the sound is coming from, it stops. Open the cell door or shine a light inside. And there's nothing, no one, just the empty interior of a cell that hasn't housed a living person in over 3 decades. This particular phenomenon is interesting because snoring is such a mundane sound, so completely ordinary. It's not the kind of thing you'd expect in a ghost story. No chains rattling, no ominous whispers, just the sound of someone sleeping. But that's exactly what makes it so unsettling. The cell blocks haven't housed living inmates since 1990. The snoring shouldn't be there. And yet, multiple people report it, often in different cells, suggesting it's not just one residual haunting, but multiple ones, or perhaps a more general phenomenon where the sounds of prison life, of men sleeping in their cells, have somehow been recorded in the building itself and played back at random intervals. There are also reports of voices in the cell blocks. Not always distinct enough to make out words, but clearly human voices, having conversations, sometimes calling out, sometimes laughing. These voices are typically described as coming from deeper in the cell block, from cells that are too far away or too poorly lit to see clearly. When investigators move toward the source of the voices, they fade or stop entirely. It's as if the sound is always just out of reach, always in the next cell or on the next tier. The cells themselves, when you step inside one, are claustrophobic in a way that's difficult to convey in words. Even knowing you can leave whenever you want, even with the door open and a tour group just outside, stepping into one of these cells triggers a visceral response. The walls are close, too close. The ceiling is low. The light, if there's any natural light at all, is dim and filtered. The toilet is right there, mere feet from where you'd sleep, no partition, no privacy. The sink, if it still works, which most don't, provides only cold water. Now imagine living in this space for months or years. Imagine sharing it with 2 or 3 other men. Imagine that the only time you leave this cell is for meals, for work details, for the occasional hour of recreation in the yard. Imagine that you can hear everything happening on your tier, every argument, every cry of pain, every sound of violence, but you can't see what's happening, can't intervene, can only listen and wait and hope that whatever's happening doesn't happen to you next. The psychological damage inflicted by these conditions was immense. Many inmates developed what we now recognize as symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, depression, dissociative disorders. Some never fully recovered after their release. Some, as we've discussed, never made it to release at all. And if you believe in residual hauntings, if you accept the possibility that intense emotional energy can be recorded in physical spaces, then the cell blocks would be prime locations for such phenomena. Thousands of men experiencing years of fear, rage, despair, all of that emotion compressed into these narrow steel and concrete corridors. If anywhere would hold an imprint of human suffering, it would be here. Standing in the cell blocks, especially if you're alone or if you're there after dark, you feel it. The weight of all those years, all those lives, all that suffering. It's not a metaphor or a ghost story convention. It's a tangible sensation, a pressure that seems to push down on your chest, making breathing harder, making your heart race for no reason you can identify. Maybe it's just anxiety, your body responding rationally to an environment that your instincts recognize as dangerous, even though you know intellectually that you're safe. Maybe it's the accumulation of small sensory cues, sounds and smells, and the play of shadows that your conscious mind doesn't fully process, but that trigger your fight or flight response. Or maybe it's something more. Maybe in a place where so much occurred, where the membrane between life and death grew thin from being crossed so many times, something remains. Not ghosts in the Hollywood sense, not spirits with unfinished business who want to communicate with the living, but something more primal. The echo of suffering, the residue of souls in torment, the memory of darkness that never fully lifted. The Cellblocks hold that darkness still. And as we move deeper into the Reformatory's haunted geography, into spaces that were even darker than the cells, into the punishment areas where men were sent to be broken, that darkness deepens. The hole awaits. So does the chair room. And below everything, beneath even the lowest tier of the cell blocks, the basement spreads like a network of tunnels, cold and fetid and filled with things that even the guards feared to encounter. These are the dark places, and they're where the Reformatory's reputation for being one of America's most haunted locations truly earns its weight. The dark places. Every prison has its special horrors, spaces set aside specifically for punishment, for breaking the wills of men who refuse to be broken by standard incarceration alone. In the Ohio State Reformatory, these spaces were collectively known as solitary confinement, though inmates had their own names for them. The hole was the most common designation, simple and descriptive. Down in the hole, sent to the hole. 3 days in the hole. The terminology was universal across American prisons, a shared language of suffering. The hole at the Ohio State Reformatory was located in the basement of the East Cell Block, accessed by narrow staircases that descended into increasing darkness. Even by the standards of early 20th century prisons, these solitary cells were brutal. Each was small, roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, with a concrete floor and steel walls. There were no windows. The only light came from the corridor outside when guards opened the viewing slot in the door, and they rarely did that unless they were delivering food or checking to make sure the inmate was still alive. The darkness in the hole wasn't merely the absence of light. It was absolute, total, the kind of darkness that disorients, that makes you lose track of your body's boundaries, that causes hallucinations after only a few hours. Men sent to the hole weren't provided with bedding, not initially. They slept on the concrete floor, using their arms as pillows if they could sleep at all. The temperature was whatever the basement happened to be, cold in winter since there was no heat, sweltering in summer since there was no ventilation. The standard punishment for serious infractions was 72 hours in the hole. 3 days, 72 hours of darkness, of near-complete sensory deprivation, of being trapped in a space barely larger than a coffin stood on end. Inmates who were sent to the hole described the experience, in the few accounts that have survived, as worse than anything else the prison inflicted on them. Worse than beatings, worse than the crowding in the regular cells, worse than the constant threat of violence from other inmates, because the hole attacked your mind directly. Without light, without sound beyond the occasional distant echo from the cell blocks above, without any way to mark the passage of time, your brain began to turn on itself. Panic attacks were common in the first hours. Claustrophobia overwhelmed even men who had never experienced it before. Some men screamed, pounding on the walls until their hands bled, begging to be let out. Guards ignored the screaming. That was part of the punishment. After the panic came the hallucinations. Visual hallucinations were impossible in that absolute darkness, but auditory and tactile hallucinations were common. Men heard voices, conversations, sometimes music. They felt things crawling on their skin, though the hole was regularly cleaned and pest-free. They felt hands touching them, grabbing them, though they were alone. The mind, desperate for input, began manufacturing its own. Some men emerged from the hole relatively intact, shaken but still recognizably themselves. These were typically men who had mental fortitude or previous experience with isolation, or who had simply been lucky in how their brains responded to the deprivation. Other men emerged changed, broken in ways that no physical torture could achieve. They were catatonic, unresponsive, staring at nothing. Or they were hysterical, unable to calm down, flinching at every sound. Some never fully recovered, spending the rest of their sentences in a kind of psychological limbo, neither fully present nor absent. And some men didn't emerge at all. There are documented deaths in the hole, though the exact number is unclear because prison records from the early decades of the Reformatory's operation are incomplete. Some of these deaths were from medical conditions that went untreated. A man having a heart attack in the hole, with no way to call for help and guards not checking regularly, could easily die before anyone discovered the problem. Some deaths were suicides, men who found ways to end their lives even in that stripped-down environment, using shoelaces or torn strips of clothing, or simply battering their heads against the walls until they caused fatal injuries. And at least one death in the hole was murder. The story, which has become part of the Reformatory's darker lore, involves two inmates being placed in the same cell in the hole. This violated protocol. Solitary was supposed to be solitary, but the hole had limited capacity and overcrowding affected even punishment cells. The two men placed together were known to be violent, both serving time for serious offenses, both with disciplinary records that suggested they were dangerous even by prison standards. No one knows what happened in that cell during their 72-hour sentence. The concrete walls were thick enough that sounds didn't carry well. Guards didn't check regularly. When they finally opened the door at the end of the 3 days, only one man walked out. The other was dead, beaten so severely that his skull was fractured, stuffed partially under the steel cot that was the cell's only furniture. The surviving man never spoke about what happened, never offered an explanation. He was charged with murder, his sentence extended, but he never broke his silence. That cell, which can still be identified in the basement, is now one of the most active paranormal locations in the entire Reformatory. Visitors report immediate and intense reactions upon entering. The temperature drops precipitously, not the mild chill reported in other parts of the building, but a cold that seems to sink into your bones. Breathing becomes difficult, not from any physical obstruction, but from a sense of oppression, as if the air itself is hostile. Many people experience nausea, dizziness, or panic attacks. Electronic equipment behaves erratically in that cell. Cameras drain batteries in seconds. Recording devices capture strange noises, thuds and scrapes, and what sounds like labored breathing. EVP sessions allegedly produce voices, sometimes two voices talking over each other, sometimes what sounds like a struggle. Some investigators and visitors report being physically touched in that cell, pushed, grabbed, even scratched. There are photographs of people leaving the cell with red marks on their arms or backs, marks that weren't there before they entered. Skeptics suggest these are self-inflicted, consciously or unconsciously, products of the power of suggestion and the high stress of the environment. Believers suggest they're evidence of an entity or entities that remain in that space, still acting out the violence that occurred there decades ago. The entire whole area, not just that one cell, has a reputation for being difficult to investigate. Even experienced paranormal researchers, people who have investigated hundreds of reportedly haunted locations without incident, report feeling unwelcome in the hole. It's not a passive space. It seems to resist investigation, to push back against intruders. Equipment fails more often here than anywhere else in the Reformatory. Investigators report feeling dizzy, disoriented, unable to concentrate. Some have panic attacks, so severe they have to leave immediately. A few have reported physical illness, vomiting or fainting, responses that seem disproportionate to any normal environmental factors. From a skeptical perspective, these reactions are entirely explainable. The hole is in the basement, where air quality is poor and carbon dioxide levels might be elevated. It's dark, triggering natural fear responses. It's cramped, exacerbating claustrophobia. And everyone who visits knows the history, knows what happened here, priming them to experience fear and discomfort. The mind is powerful enough to create all of these symptoms without any paranormal involvement. But the sheer intensity and consistency of reactions in the whole, particularly in that one cell, gives even skeptics pause. Something about that space affects people profoundly. Whether it's ghosts or psychology or some combination of both, the hole remains one of the most disturbing locations in the Reformatory. Beyond the hole, the basement contains other unsettling spaces. There's a long corridor, essentially a tunnel, that runs beneath the cell blocks. This tunnel was used for maintenance access and for moving supplies without disrupting the flow of inmates in the main corridors above. It's dark, narrow, with low ceilings and a floor that's often damp from groundwater seepage. Walking through this tunnel, even with modern LED flashlights, feels like descending into a grave. Two entities are said to haunt the basement, and their stories reflect the range of tragedy that occurred at the Reformatory. The first is the spirit of a young boy, reportedly only 14 years old, who was beaten to death in the basement. The accounts don't agree on when this happened or who the boy was, which is frustrating from a historical verification standpoint. Some versions say it occurred in the early years of the Reformatory, when it was still accepting very young offenders. Other versions place it later, suggesting the boy was unusually young to be at the facility. What is consistent across accounts is that the boy was brutally murdered, beaten by either other inmates or, in some versions, by guards. His body was left in the basement, and he is said to haunt the tunnel still. Witnesses describe seeing a shadow that moves quickly, flickering across walls and ceilings, always at the edge of vision, never quite visible directly. The shadow is described as small, child-sized, and its movement suggests it's fleeing, running from something. The emotional tone associated with this entity is described as light, not threatening. Investigators who have encountered it say it feels sad, frightened, but not malevolent. Some have reported hearing what sounds like a child crying, soft sobs coming from the darkness of the tunnels. Others report a sense of innocence, as if whatever is there is seeking protection rather than threatening harm. The second entity in the basement is very different. This one is consistently described as dark, heavy, oppressive. Unlike the boy's spirit, which flees, this presence approaches. It makes itself known not through visual manifestations, but through emotional impact. People feel watched by something hostile, They feel a weight pressing down on them, a sense that they're not welcome, that they're in danger. Some investigators believe this second entity is the boy's murderer, trapped in the same space as his victim, doomed to reenact their final encounter endlessly. Others think it might be unrelated, perhaps a guard who died in the basement, or even an older spiritual presence that predates the reformatory itself, something that was drawn to the suffering that occurred here. Physical manifestations attributed to this dark entity include people being touched, usually on the shoulders or back by unseen hands. The touch is described as aggressive, not gentle, sometimes strong enough to leave bruises. There are reports of people being pushed, feeling sudden force against their backs when no one is behind them. One investigator reported being grabbed by the ankle while walking through the tunnel, the grip strong enough to make him stumble, though when he looked down, nothing was there. The basement is also where visitors and investigators report smelling smoke, specifically the smell of a campfire, with smoke mixed with the acrid smell of burning cloth. This scent is widely believed to be connected to the 1930 fire at the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus. Remember that approximately 200 to 266 survivors of that fire were transferred to the Ohio State Reformatory and initially housed in the West Attic. Many of these men would have still been wearing clothing that smelled of smoke, would have had burns that required medical attention, would have been carrying the psychological trauma of having survived while 320 of their fellow inmates burned to death. The smoke smell in the basement, which has no apparent physical source, no fires or cigarettes, or anything that would produce such a scent, is thought by some to be a residual haunting from those Columbus fire survivors. Perhaps they spent time in the basement, perhaps they hid there, or worked there, or simply passed through often enough that their presence, marked by that distinctive smoke smell, left an imprint. Above the basement, but still in the realm of the reformatory's dark places, is a location known simply as the chair room. If you're touring the reformatory and you hear about the chair room, you might imagine something ominous, some kind of execution chamber or interrogation room. But the chair room is disturbing precisely because it's so mundane. It's a windowless room, roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, with bare walls and a concrete floor. And in the center of this room, facing the door, sits a single wooden chair. That's it. Just a chair in an empty room. But there's something wrong about it, and visitors feel it immediately. The chair room is located in one of the administration areas, not in the cell blocks, not in the punishment areas, just a random room that could have been used for storage or as an office, but apparently never was, or if it was, its original purpose has been forgotten. The chair is old, heavy, institutional, the kind of chair you might find in thousands of schools or offices or waiting rooms. There's nothing visually remarkable about it. But people who enter this room report immediate and intense discomfort. The chair allegedly moves on its own. Guards and maintenance workers, back when the reformatory was operational, reported coming into the room to find the chair pushed into a corner, even though they'd left it in the center. Visitors during tours sometimes claim to see the chair shift, just slightly, as if someone invisible has sat down in it. The floor in front of the chair sometimes shows drag marks, as if the chair has been pulled across the floor, though no one can say when or by whom. The room itself feels hostile. The temperature is often unusually cold, and the air feels dense, hard to breathe. People report feeling watched with unusual intensity in the chair room, more so than in other parts of the reformatory. Some report hearing whispers or seeing shadows moving on the walls despite the lack of any light source that would create such shadows. During paranormal investigations, the chair room is used for what's called a chair sit, a challenge where a participant sits in the chair, alone, with the lights off, for 15 minutes. Many people can't complete the full 15 minutes. They report sensations of being touched, of cold hands on their shoulders or the back of their neck. Some report the chair vibrating, shaking slightly as if responding to some unseen force. Others see lights or shapes moving in the darkness around them. A few participants in chair sits have emerged with scratches, thin red marks on their arms or backs that weren't there when they entered. These are often held up as evidence of a malevolent entity in the chair room, something that actively harms people who challenge it. Skeptics counter that scratches can be self-inflicted in moments of stress, that people tensing up or moving suddenly can cause their clothing or jewelry to scratch their skin, that the power of suggestion in a dark, frightening environment is more than enough to explain these marks. But the chair room maintains its reputation as one of the most actively hostile locations in the Reformatory. Unlike the warden's quarters, where the reported haunting seems sad or confused, or the cellblocks, where the phenomena seem like echoes of past suffering, the chair room feels purposefully aggressive. Whatever is there, if anything is there, doesn't want to be known. It wants to be left alone, and it's willing to make visitors uncomfortable enough that they'll leave. These dark places, the hole, the basement, the chair room, they represent the extremes of the Ohio State Reformatory's paranormal reputation. But they're not the sum total of the tragedy that occurred within these walls. To really understand why the Reformatory is considered one of America's most haunted locations, we need to look at the individuals, the specific inmates and guards whose lives and deaths are documented, whose stories aren't just generalized suffering, but personal tragedies with names and faces and circumstances. Because haunted buildings aren't haunted by buildings. They're haunted, if they're haunted at all, by people. And the Ohio State Reformatory was home to thousands of people over its 94 years of operation, each with their own story, most forgotten, but some remembered, some whose stories have become part of the Reformatory's haunted legacy. Lives and deaths. The Ohio State Reformatory processed 154,000 inmates over its operational lifetime. That's 154,000 individual stories, 154,000 lives that intersected with this place, some briefly, some for decades. Most of these men have been forgotten. Their names exist only in prison ledgers and court records that no one consults anymore. Their faces appear only in old mugshots stored in archives. Their stories, whatever led them to crime, whatever happened to them after release, are lost to time. But some stories survive, and it's these stories that help us understand what this place was, what it did to people, and why it might still hold echoes of the past. Let's start with the guards, because guards died here too, died violently, died doing a job that was dangerous and underpaid, and that left survivors with trauma that lasted their lifetimes. Urban Wilford was 72 years old in November 1926. He'd worked as a guard at the Ohio State Reformatory for years, long enough that he was considered one of the old-timers, a fixture of the institution. On November 2nd, 1926, a former inmate named Philip Orleck, who had been paroled earlier that year, returned to the Reformatory. His intentions are lost to history. Maybe he was trying to break someone out. Maybe he had a personal grudge. Maybe he simply snapped and returned to the last place that had exerted any control over his life. Whatever his motivation, Orleck shot Urban Wilford during an escape attempt that was doomed from the start. Wilford died from his wounds. Orleck fled, but was captured 2 months later. He was tried, convicted, and executed in the electric chair at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus in 1927. Justice of a sort was served, but Wilford's death marked a turning point. Before this, guards had been hurt at the Reformatory. Certainly, injuries were common in corrections work, but none had been killed. Wilford's death shattered the illusion that this was a safe place to work, that the rehabilitative mission somehow protected staff from the violence that was endemic to all prisons. After Wilford, guards were warier, quicker to resort to force, more likely to see inmates as threats rather than as young men capable of reform. 6 years later, another guard died. Frank Hanger was 48 years old in October 1932. He was working his shift on October 2nd when 12 inmates, working together in a coordinated escape attempt, overpowered him. They beat him to death with an iron bar, a murder so brutal that it shocked even hardened corrections officials. All 12 escape attempts were quickly recaptured. None made it off the reformatory grounds. 2 of them, Merrill Chandler and Chester Probaski, were found guilty of Hanger's murder. Both were executed in the electric chair in 1935. Hanger's death reinforced what Wilford's had begun. The reformatory was becoming more violent, more dangerous, less a place of rehabilitation and more a place where survival, for inmates and guards alike, required constant vigilance. The murders of Wilford and Hanger are documented, remembered, memorialized. But there are other guard deaths that are less clear, documented in prison records as accidents or natural causes, but whispered about by staff who were there, who believed the official accounts were covering up something darker. Guards who fell downstairs. Guards who died of heart attacks that survivors believed were actually beatings. Guards who simply disappeared, their bodies never found, their fates unknown. How many of these suspected deaths actually occurred versus how many are products of prison mythology is impossible to determine now. But the belief that guards sometimes died in ways that were covered up, that violence was so pervasive that even official deaths had to be hidden to maintain some semblance of control, that belief was widespread among staff. Now, let's turn to the inmates themselves. Some came to the reformatory for minor crimes and left reformed, their time at Mansfield a turning point that led to productive lives. But these success stories, which the reformatory's early administrators loved to highlight, became rarer as the institution changed. More common were the tragedies, the men who came to the reformatory young and left broken, or who didn't leave at all. Frank Freshwaters is one of the more unusual cases associated with the Ohio State Reformatory, not because of what he did while he was there, but because of what happened after. Freshwaters was sent to the reformatory in 1959, not long before Superintendent Arthur Glatke's death, for causing a vehicular homicide in 1957. He'd hit and killed a man while driving, an accident, but one that occurred while Freshwaters was driving recklessly. He was sentenced to 20 years. But Freshwaters' behavior at the reformatory was exemplary. He was a model prisoner, polite, hard-working, never causing trouble. After just a few years, he was transferred to an honor farm, a minimum security facility where well-behaved prisoners could work outdoors and enjoy somewhat more freedom than in the main prison. This transfer was supposed to be a reward, a step toward eventual parole. Instead, Freshwaters walked away. In 1959, he simply left the honor farm, disappearing into the American landscape, and he stayed disappeared for 56 years. Freshwaters built a new life under an assumed identity, living in various states, working regular jobs, becoming a respected member of communities that had no idea they were harboring a fugitive. He wasn't caught until 2015, when he was 79 years old, living in Florida. By that point, the man he'd killed had been dead for nearly 60 years. The prosecutors who'd convicted him were long retired or deceased. He was finally returned to Ohio to serve out the remaining years of his sentence. Freshwater's story is remarkable not for violence, but for its sheer improbability. How did a man escape from Ohio's prison system and stay free for more than 5 decades? How did he build an entire life without ever being discovered? And why, when he was finally caught, did he express no remorse, no real explanation for his decades of freedom? He simply said he'd walked away because he could, because the Honor Farm had insufficient security, because he preferred freedom to incarceration. It's a pragmatic answer, but one that leaves so many questions unanswered. Then there are the inmates who didn't escape, who stayed in the Reformatory and became part of its violent history. We've already discussed James Lockhart, who set himself on fire, and Larry Hamer, who hanged himself. But there are so many other deaths, each with its own story. Men died in fights over nothing, over slights so small that outsiders can barely comprehend how they escalated to murder. A stolen piece of bread, a comment about someone's family, a rumor about cooperation with guards. In the pressure cooker environment of the overcrowded cell blocks, violence could erupt from any spark, and once it started, it was difficult to stop. Guards couldn't be everywhere, and even when they responded quickly, they were often too late. Men died from disease, from tuberculosis that spread through the close quarters of the cells, from infections that went untreated because the infirmary was overwhelmed, from conditions that would have been easily treatable on the outside, but were fatal in prison. The Reformatory had a hospital wing, medical staff who did their best, but they were always understaffed, always under-resourced, always fighting a losing battle against the sheer number of sick inmates. And men died from the despair of incarceration itself. Suicides weren't always as dramatic as Lockhart's self-immolation. More often they were quiet, private, a man hanging himself from cell bars late at night, discovered only when guards made their morning count. Or a man slitting his wrists with a sharpened piece of metal, bleeding out on his cell floor while his cellmates pretended to sleep, not wanting to be involved, knowing that reporting it would only bring questions and suspicion. The Reformatory Cemetery, located just outside what used to be the prison wall, contains over 200 bodies, inmates who died during their sentences and whose families either couldn't afford to claim the bodies or chose not to. These graves are marked with simple stones, numbers rather than names, a final indignity for men who were already stripped of so much during their lives. The cemetery is reportedly difficult to photograph. Cameras allegedly malfunction or produce strange results, images that show mists or orbs or shadows that weren't visible to the naked eye. Metal grave markers are said to move on their own, found in different positions than where they were placed. But perhaps the most tragic category of deaths at the Ohio State Reformatory, beyond the murders and suicides and deaths from disease, are those connected to the 1930 fire survivors. We've touched on this already, but it deserves fuller exploration because it reveals something about how trauma spreads, how one tragedy can metastasize into dozens or hundreds of subsequent tragedies. The 320 men who died in the Ohio State Penitentiary fire in Columbus on April 21st, 1930, died horribly. Trapped in their cells, they burned or suffocated. The survivors, more than 600 men, saw and heard their fellow inmates die. They were burned themselves, many severely. They were left psychologically shattered by an experience that was as close to hell as any human being is likely to encounter. When these survivors were dispersed to other Ohio prisons, including the Ohio State Reformatory, they brought their trauma with them. And trauma doesn't stay contained. It spreads. The men who survived the fire had nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. Some became violent, lashing out at guards or other inmates in response to triggers that others couldn't see. Some withdrew completely, becoming catatonic, unresponsive to any stimulation. Some required constant medical attention for their burns, attention that the reformatory's limited medical staff couldn't adequately provide. And they died, not all at once, but steadily over the years following the fire. Some from complications of their burns, infections that wouldn't heal, organs damaged by smoke inhalation failing over time. Some from the psychological trauma, men who simply gave up, stopped eating, stopped fighting, and allowed themselves to fade away. And some from violence, becoming involved in altercations, either as aggressors or victims, because their damaged psyches couldn't navigate the complex social hierarchies of prison life. The West Attic, where many of these fire survivors were initially housed, is now one of the most reported paranormal locations in the entire reformatory. The smoke smell we mentioned earlier is strongest here. Voices are heard, sometimes screaming, sometimes just muttering. The signatures scratched into the walls by inmates are still visible, and some visitors report that new signatures appear, marks that weren't there on previous visits, though this could easily be other visitors adding graffiti rather than anything paranormal. What's particularly unsettling about the West Attic is the emotional atmosphere. Even people who know nothing about the history, who haven't been told about the fire survivors, report feeling overwhelming despair in this space. Not fear, not anger, just profound, crushing sadness. Some visitors have panic attacks in the attic. Others start crying without knowing why. It's as if the collective trauma of those men, their suffering and their sorrow, saturated the space and remains detectable decades later. We should also talk about the Ohio State Reformatory's involvement in some notorious crimes that occurred beyond its walls. Several inmates who either escaped from the reformatory or were paroled went on to commit terrible crimes. Crimes that might not have happened if the reformatory had been more successful in its rehabilitative mission or more secure in its containment of dangerous men. One particularly dark incident occurred on July 21st, 1948, when two former inmates, John West and Robert Daniels, kidnapped the reformatory's farm superintendent, his wife, and their 20-year-old daughter from the honor farm. The superintendent survived, but his wife and daughter were murdered. West was killed by police during the manhunt. Daniels was captured, convicted, and executed in the electric chair. The crime shocked Ohio and raised serious questions about the reformatory's security, particularly at the honor farm, which was supposed to house only low-risk inmates. These individual stories, these named deaths and documented tragedies, they give context to the more general claims about the reformatory being haunted. When paranormal investigators talk about sensing spirits, about capturing EVPs, or photographing anomalies, they're not talking about abstract ghosts. They're talking about Urban Wilford and Frank Hanger, guards who died violently. They're talking about James Lockhart and Larry Hamer, inmates who chose death over continued imprisonment. They're talking about the 200-plus men buried in unmarked graves. They're talking about the fire survivors who brought hell with them to Mansfield. Every haunted location, if it's haunted at all, is haunted by specific people with specific stories. The Ohio State Reformatory has more than enough tragedy in its history to account for 1,000 hauntings. Whether those hauntings are real, whether the spirits of the dead actually linger in these halls, is a question each person has to answer for themselves. But the deaths are real. The suffering was real. And the memory of that suffering, preserved in prison records and newspaper accounts and in the bones of the building itself, is undeniably present. Standing in the reformatory, walking through spaces where you know people died, where violence occurred, where despair was a constant companion, you can't help but feel the weight of that history. Whether what you're feeling is ghosts or simply empathy, simply your imagination engaging with documented tragedy, the effect is the same. The past isn't past here. It's present, immediate, pressing in on you from all sides. And that brings us to the question of preservation, of how this building scheduled for demolition became instead a monument, a historic site, a place where 120,000 visitors come every year to tour, to investigate, to connect with a past that refuses to stay buried. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because of a movie, a film adaptation of a Stephen King story that captured something true about American prisons, about hope and despair, about the human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. It happened because The Shawshank Redemption made the Ohio State Reformatory famous, turned it from a forgotten relic into an icon. The Shawshank Connection. In the early 1990s, the Ohio State Reformatory stood empty, its last prisoners transferred to the new Mansfield Correctional Institution in December 1990, its doors locked, its future uncertain. The state of Ohio, which still owned the property, had plans to demolish the main building. The outbuildings had already been torn down, the perimeter wall reduced to rubble. Only the central administration block and the 2 cell blocks remained, and they wouldn't remain for long. A wrecking ball was literally on site, positioned outside the building, ready to begin demolition in 1993. Then a phone call came. A location scout working for Castle Rock Entertainment, the production company behind a new film adaptation of a Stephen King novella, wanted to tour the facility. The scout was looking for a prison that could serve as the fictional Shawshank State Prison, the setting for a story about a man wrongly convicted of murder who spends 20 years in prison before engineering an elaborate escape. Director Frank Darabont had very specific requirements for the location. It needed to look imposing, threatening, a place where hope would naturally die. It needed to have the architectural gravitas that would justify the extended sequences the script called for. Scenes in a warden's office, long corridors, cell blocks that could accommodate camera crews. And ideally, it needed to feel authentically old, not a modern facility pretending to be from an earlier era, but an actual building with decades of history soaked into its walls. The location scout took one look at the Ohio State Reformatory and knew the search was over. The Gothic exterior was perfect, exactly the kind of ominous presence the film needed. The cell blocks, though deteriorating, were filmable. The warden's quarters, recently inhabited by Arthur Glattke, could serve as the corrupt Warden Norton's office with minimal set dressing. Even the state of disrepair worked in the film's favor, giving locations an authentic sense of age and wear. Castle Rock Entertainment negotiated with the state of Ohio for permission to film at the Reformatory, agreeing to pay for access and to repair any damage caused during filming. And in the summer of 1993, just months before the building was scheduled to be demolished, a film crew moved into the Ohio State Reformatory and began transforming it into Shawshank State Prison. The transformation was less extensive than you might think. The exterior required almost no modification. It was already intimidating enough. The interior scenes were shot in the warden's quarters and in other administrative spaces, with set decorators bringing in period-appropriate furniture and props. The famous scene where Andy Dufresne, played by Tim Robbins, locks himself in the warden's office and plays Mozart over the prison's loudspeaker system, that was filmed in Arthur Glattke's actual office. The desk Andy sits at, the window he looks out of, the door the guards try to break through, all of these are original to the Reformatory. Interestingly, the Cellblocks scenes, which are so central to the film, weren't filmed at the Ohio State Reformatory. Those were shot elsewhere, in a warehouse that was converted into a Cellblocks set for the production. But many of the transitional shots, wide establishing shots showing the scope of Shawshank, those used the Reformatory's east and west cell blocks. The production wrapped in September 1993, just weeks before demolition was scheduled to begin. But something had changed. Local residents, who had been watching the filming with interest, began to see the Reformatory differently. It wasn't just an old prison anymore. It was going to be part of cinema history. Even before The Shawshank Redemption was released, before anyone knew if the film would be successful, people in Mansfield started asking questions. Did the building really need to be demolished? Couldn't it be saved? Wasn't there historical value in preserving it? The film was released in September 1994 to good reviews but modest box office. It wasn't a hit, not initially, but something remarkable happened in the months and years following its theatrical run. The Shawshank Redemption found its audience through home video rentals and television broadcasts. It became one of the most beloved films of the 1990s, regularly cited as one of the greatest films ever made. It developed a devoted following, and a significant number of those fans wanted to see Shawshank State Prison in real life, wanted to walk where Andy and Red had walked, wanted to stand in the warden's office where Andy had played Mozart. But by 1995, demolition of the Reformatory had begun. The state of Ohio was moving forward with its plans, clearing the site to make room for expansion of the new prison facilities. Large sections of the building were already gone, torn down, removed. The Reformatory's days were clearly numbered. That's when a group of local residents and business leaders formed the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society, a nonprofit organization with the single goal of saving what remained of the Ohio State Reformatory. They made an audacious proposal to the state: transfer ownership of the building to the Preservation Society for the token sum of $1. And the society would take on responsibility for maintaining and restoring it. The state of Ohio, perhaps recognizing that the building's connection to the Shawshank Redemption gave it value, perhaps simply wanting to be rid of the liability and expense of demolishing such a massive structure, agreed. In 1995, the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society became the owner of the Ohio State Reformatory for $1. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Shawshank Redemption saved the building. Without the film, there would have been no public interest in preservation. The building would have been demolished, the land cleared, and one of Ohio's most significant historical structures would have been erased. But because Castle Rock Entertainment chose the Reformatory as a filming location, because the movie captured something universal about the human spirit and became beloved by millions, the building was granted a reprieve, a second life as a historic site and tourist attraction. The Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society immediately began the enormous task of stabilizing the building and making it safe for visitors. This wasn't restoration in the traditional sense. There was no budget for that, no possibility of returning the reformatory to some pristine historical state. This was triage, preventing further collapse, shoring up dangerous areas, cleaning out debris, making the building accessible. And then, cautiously, they began offering tours. The first tours were basic, daytime guided walks through the safe areas of the building, focused primarily on the fill connection. Visitors wanted to see the warden's office, wanted to walk the corridor where Andy had emerged from his tunnel, wanted to experience Shawshank. The society obliged, creating tours that highlighted the filming locations while also educating visitors about the building's actual history. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Thousands of people, many from out of state, made pilgrimages to Mansfield to see the Reformatory. The local economy, which had been struggling since the closure of manufacturing plants in the 1980s, received a boost from tourism. Hotels filled with visitors. Restaurants served movie fans who wanted to talk about their favorite scenes. The Ohio State Reformatory, which had been a source of shame for decades, a symbol of the worst aspects of the American prison system, became Mansfield's claim to fame. But something unexpected was happening alongside the Shawshank tourism. Visitors who came to see a filming location were discovering that the building had its own story, separate from the movie, a story of actual inmates and guards, of the rise and fall of the rehabilitative ideal, of architectural ambition and institutional failure. Some visitors came for the movie and stayed for the history. Others came for both, but found themselves drawn to a third aspect of the Reformatory, its reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. The paranormal angle developed organically. Staff and volunteers working on the restoration reported strange experiences. Footsteps when no one was there, doors opening or closing on their own, cold spots that appeared suddenly and dissipated just as quickly, voices distant but distinct coming from cellblocks that were supposed to be empty. The sense of being watched, of being followed, of never being quite alone, even when you're the only living person in a wing of the building. Some of these reports could be dismissed as natural phenomena. Old buildings make noise, especially massive old buildings with metal structures that expand and contract with temperature changes. Air currents cause doors to move. The human brain is wired to find patterns and to interpret ambiguous stimuli, especially in creepy environments, as something meaningful, as ghosts or spirits or presence. But the sheer volume of reports, the consistency across different observers, the fact that many incidents were experienced by skeptics who had no expectation of paranormal activity, these factors gave the stories credibility, or at least made them interesting enough that people wanted to investigate for themselves. In the early 2000s, the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society made a decision that would transform the Reformatory's public image even more dramatically than the Shawshank Redemption had. They decided to embrace the paranormal reputation and begin offering ghost tours and paranormal investigation opportunities. The first ghost tours were simple, evening tours that took groups through the building with minimal lighting, stopping in locations where paranormal activity had been reported to tell stories and give participants a chance to experience the building after dark. These tours were popular immediately, selling out regularly, attracting not just paranormal enthusiasts but also people who simply wanted a spooky experience, a safe thrill. Then came the overnight investigations. These were more serious, more involved events where groups would have access to the reformatory from late evening until early morning, allowing them to set up equipment and conduct investigations in a way that paranormal research teams actually work. These events attracted a different clientele, people who took the paranormal seriously, who invested in EMF detectors and digital recorders and thermal cameras, who wanted data rather than just stories. The reformatory quickly gained a reputation in the paranormal community as a must-visit location. Teams from across the country, and eventually from around the world, came to investigate. Some of the biggest names in paranormal television filmed episodes at the reformatory. Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, Scariest Places on Earth, Portals to Hell, Destination Fear. All of these shows and more featured the Ohio State Reformatory, capturing supposed evidence and sharing the building's spooky reputation with audiences in the millions. Each television appearance brought more visitors. Each investigation yielded more stories. The reformatory became a feedback loop of paranormal interest, where the expectation of hauntings made people more likely to interpret ambiguous experiences as paranormal, which reinforced the reputation, which brought more people with even higher expectations. But here's the interesting thing. While skeptics might dismiss this as simple commercialization of superstition, the paranormal interest has directly funded the building's preservation. The revenue from ghost tours, overnight investigations, paranormal events, that money goes to the Mansfield Reformatory Preservation Society, which uses it for ongoing restoration and maintenance. Without the paranormal tourism, the reformatory likely couldn't afford to keep operating. The daytime historical tours alone wouldn't generate enough revenue to maintain such a large building. So in a very real sense, the ghosts, or at least the belief in ghosts, are saving the reformatory just as surely as the Shawshank Redemption did. The living are preserving the building because of their fascination with the dead, or with the possibility of the dead, or simply with the building's dark history. Whatever the actual truth about hauntings, the phenomenon has had a tangible, positive effect on historic preservation. The reformatory now hosts multiple types of events beyond just tours and investigations. They host the annual Shawshank Hustle, a 7K race that starts and ends at the reformatory, attracting hundreds of runners. They host Blood Prison, an elaborate haunted house attraction during the Halloween season that uses actors and special effects to create scares, as opposed to the ghost tours which rely on the building's actual atmosphere. They rent the space for weddings, photo shoots, corporate events, even concerts and theater productions. In 2024, the reformatory hosted the Shawshank 30th anniversary celebration, a major event bringing together cast members from the film, thousands of fans, and extensive programming celebrating the movie's legacy. The event was a massive success, demonstrating that 30 years after the film's release, the connection between Shawshank Redemption and the Ohio State Reformatory remains strong, remains culturally significant. But for all the success of the preservation efforts, for all the visitors and events and media attention, the building remains a difficult, sometimes uncomfortable place. It's not a theme park. It's not a cleaned-up Hollywood version of a prison. It's an actual former prison, with all the weight and darkness that implies. The restoration work has stabilized the structure, but large sections remain exactly as they were when the prison closed in 1990. Peeling paint, crumbling plaster, broken windows, rust-stained metal. All of this is preserved intentionally because it's authentic, because it tells the truth about what this place was. Walking through the Ohio State Reformatory today, Whether you're on a daytime historical tour or a midnight paranormal investigation, you're walking through genuine history. The cells where men lived are still there. The hole where men were tortured is still there. The warden's quarters where Helen Glattke died are still there. This isn't a recreation or a museum exhibit with mannequins and explanatory placards. This is the actual place, barely changed, waiting. Walking through the darkness. What's it like to actually visit the Ohio State Reformatory today, to walk through the building as it currently exists, to experience firsthand the spaces we've been discussing? Let's walk through a typical overnight paranormal investigation, the kind of event that the Reformatory hosts regularly, to get a sense of what visitors encounter. You arrive at the Reformatory around 9 p.m., when the gates open for the overnight group. The parking lot, which during daytime tours can hold hundreds of cars, is now mostly empty, just your group and a few staff vehicles. The building looms against the night sky, its Gothic towers silhouetted, a few lights visible in windows, but most of the structure dark. The first thing you notice before you even exit your car is how quiet it is. The Reformatory is outside the main part of town, surrounded by open land, and at night, there's almost no ambient noise. No traffic, no voices, just silence and the occasional sound of wind moving through the old structure. You check in at the small office building that serves as the gift shop and museum. Staff members greet you, check your paperwork, have you signed liability waivers acknowledging that you're entering a historic building with potential hazards. They go over the rules: no smoking, no alcohol, stay out of marked restricted areas, don't vandalize anything, don't steal anything. Respect the building and what happened here. Then they give you your access wristband and point you toward the administration block entrance. Walking across the grounds from the office to the main building, you get your first real sense of the Reformatory scale. It's massive, far larger than photographs convey. The administration block alone is 6 stories, the cell blocks extending from it like wings. You're told that the building once had a 25-foot wall surrounding it, that there were dozens of outbuildings, that what remains is just a fraction of what the complex once was, and it still feels overwhelming. You enter through the main doors, the same doors that thousands of inmates pass through, and immediately the temperature drops. It's not just that the building lacks central heating, though it does. It's that stone and steel hold cold, and this building is full of both. Your footsteps echo as you walk down the central corridor toward the guard room, where the orientation will take place. Other visitors are arriving, small groups, couples, solo investigators hauling equipment cases. Some are clearly experienced, setting up tripods and checking equipment before the orientation even begins. Others look nervous, excited, uncertain what to expect. The staff member leading your overnight investigation gathers everyone in the guard room and gives a brief history of the building, hitting the highlights, construction dates, the transition from reformatory to maximum security, the closure, the Shawshank connection. Then they talk about safety, physical safety, watch your step on the metal stairs, don't lean on the railings, some are loose, use your flashlights, buddy system recommended. And then, casually, almost as an afterthought, they mention the paranormal aspect. A lot of people experience things here. The staff member says, you might hear sounds, feel temperature changes, sense something. That's normal here. Just remember, you're guests in this building. Treat it with respect. Treat any spirits you might encounter with respect, and you should be fine. The use of should be rather than will be isn't reassuring. Then you turned loose. The overnight investigation runs from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m., 5 hours where your group has access to most of the building. The staff provides a guided tour first, taking everyone through the main areas, explaining what each space was used for, sharing stories about documented incidents and paranormal reports. This tour takes about an hour, and it's your chance to get oriented, to see where everything is, to decide where you want to focus your investigation. The tour starts in the administration block, moving through the offices and meeting rooms, all of which look frozen in time. Desks still have papers on them. Chairs are pushed back as if someone just stood up. Filing cabinets stand open, their contents spilling out. The staff explains that much of this is staged, that the building has been used for so many film and photo shoots that props and set dressing have accumulated, but some of it is original, remnants of the Reformatory's operational days. Then you climb the stairs to the second floor, to the warden's quarters. The restoration here is more complete. The rooms have been furnished to look roughly as they would have in the 1950s. The master bedroom, where Helen Glattke was shot, is somber. The closet door is open, the shelf where the gun fell visible. The staff member tells the story, factual, no embellishment, and then mentions that this is one of the most frequently reported locations for rose perfume scents. Several people in your group immediately claim to smell roses. Others, including you, smell only the musty odor of an old building. Whether the rose smellers are experiencing something genuine or whether the power of suggestion is at work, they seem sincere in their reactions. From the warden's quarters, you descend back to the ground floor and approach the entrance to the west cell block. The staff member pauses before opening the door, letting the moment build. The cell blocks are where most of the activity happens. They say they're also the most physically challenging parts of the building. The stairs are steep, the catwalks are narrow, and it's dark. Stay alert, watch your footing, and if you feel uncomfortable, it's okay to leave. Nobody will think less of you. The door opens, and you step into the west cell block. The scale hits you immediately, even though you've seen photos, even though you've mentally prepared. 5 tiers of cells stretching up into darkness. Metal walkways creating geometric patterns. The air noticeably colder and damper than in the administration block. The acoustics are strange. Your footsteps echo, but so do sounds from other parts of the building, making it impossible to tell where noises are originating. The tour guide leads you along the ground floor, shining their flashlight up toward the higher tiers. In the intermittent light, you can see cell doors hanging open, some on their hinges, some fall into the walkways. You can see the cells themselves, small, dark, almost coffin-like. The guide stops at one particular cell and tells the story of an inmate who died there. The official version is illness, but rumors say it was violence. Several people in your group take photos of the cell. When you review the photos later, assuming you take any, you'll see what everyone sees, shadows that might be something or might be nothing, tricks of light and low-quality phone cameras. The tour continues up to the 3rd tier, climbing metal stairs that clang under your feet and sway slightly. Enough to remind you that this structure is old, that not everything has been reinforced for safety. From the 3rd tier, you can look down to the ground floor and up to the tiers above. The vertigo is real. The sense of exposure is uncomfortable. The guide points out areas where suicides occurred, where fights broke out, where the worst of the Reformatory's violence took place. Then you move to the east cell block, even larger, even more imposing. 6 tiers here, the uppermost tier so far above the ground floor that looking up makes your neck ache. This is where James Lockhart died. The guide tells you, though they don't specify which cell. They mention the snoring sounds people report, the voices, the sensation of being watched. On cue, someone in your group claims to hear something. Everyone stops, goes silent, listening. You hear something. Maybe a creak, a distant metallic sound. Could be anything or nothing. The tour moves through the rest of the building, touching on the chapel where inmates attended mandatory religious services, the dining hall, the workshops, the library. Each space has its stories, its documented history, and its paranormal reputation. By the time you return to the guardroom, an hour and a half has passed, and you're ready to begin your own investigation. This is where the overnight investigation shifts from passive tour to active exploration. Your group splits up, some people heading immediately for the cell blocks, others wanting to spend time in the warden's quarters, some intrigued by the basement or the chair room. You have equipment, EMF detectors that measure electromagnetic fields, digital recorders for capturing EVP, thermal cameras, flashlights with red filters that supposedly don't disturb spirits. Let's say you decide to start in the east cell block, heading up to the 6th tier where activity is frequently reported. You climb the stairs, each tier bringing you higher, the ground floor receding below you, the ceiling above still distant. By the time you reach the 6th tier, you're breathing hard, partly from the physical exertion, partly from nerves. You're about 60 feet above the ground floor, standing on a metal walkway that feels less solid than you'd like, surrounded by empty cells. You set up your equipment, EMF detector on the walkway, digital recorder running, thermal camera scanning the corridor. And then you wait. You call out, following the protocols you've learned from paranormal investigation shows. Is anyone here? Can you make your presence known? We're here to listen to your story. For a long time, nothing happens. You hear sounds, distant clangs, and creaks, but they could be other investigators moving through the building, could be the structure settling. Your EMF detector occasionally spikes, but EMF spikes can be caused by electrical wiring, even old wiring, even wiring that's not actively powered. You're starting to think this is going to be uneventful. Then the temperature drops. Not gradually, but suddenly. You watch the thermal camera's reading fall from 55 degrees to 48 degrees in seconds. The cold is focused, not evenly distributed. You can step a few feet to the left and feel warmer air. Step back to where you were and feel the cold again. It's unsettling, visceral, your body responding to the temperature change with a shiver that you can't control. You call out again. Is someone here causing this cold? Your EMF detector spikes, a sustained reading rather than a brief fluctuation. You ask, if you can hear me, can you make the EMF detector go off again? For a moment, nothing. Then it spikes again, holding for several seconds before dropping back to baseline. This is where belief and skepticism collide. The believer interpretation is clear. You've made contact with a spirit who is responding to your questions, manipulating electromagnetic fields and temperature to communicate. The skeptical interpretation is also available. The temperature change could be a draft, air moving through the building in ways you're not tracking, and the EMF spikes could be electrical interference, random fluctuations that you're interpreting as responses because you want to find patterns. You can't prove either interpretation is correct. You're alone on this tier, or at least you think you are, in near darkness, in a building with a documented history of death and violence. And something is happening that your equipment is registering. Whether it's paranormal or mundane, you're having an experience, and that experience is affecting you, raising your heart rate, sharpening your senses, making the hairs on your arms stand up. You continue the investigation for another hour on the 6th tier, capturing what you think might be EVPs, faint sounds on your recorder that sound like voices when you play them back, but are so indistinct you can't make out words. You photograph the corridor repeatedly, and in one photo, there appears to be a shadow on the walkway about 20 feet from you, a human-shaped shadow that wasn't visible to your naked eye when you took the picture. Is it a ghost? Is it a trick of light and shadow in an environment full of both? You don't know. Eventually, you move to other locations. The chair room, where you sit in the chair for 10 minutes, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, not because anything specific happens, but because the atmosphere of the room is oppressive, makes you want to leave. The warden's quarters, where you spend time in the master bedroom, never smelling roses, but definitely feeling something, a sadness that seems to permeate the space. The hole, where you descend into the basement, into the punishment cells, and feel viscerally how horrific it would have been to be confined there, how the darkness and isolation would have broken you in ways that physical torture couldn't match. By 2:30 a.m., you're exhausted. The adrenaline that carried you through the first hours has worn off. You're cold, tired, overwhelmed by the sheer emotional weight of the building. You return to the guard room where staff have set up a break area, where other investigators are gathering to share experiences, to compare notes, to process what they've encountered. Everyone has stories. Someone captured an EVP that clearly says a name. Someone else's camera battery drained completely in the chair room despite being fully charged minutes earlier. Someone felt hands on their shoulders in the west cell block. Someone saw a shadow figure moving along the fifth tier. Are these experiences real? Are they proof of the paranormal? Or are they the products of exhausted minds, overactive imaginations, and the deep human need to find meaning in ambiguous stimuli? You won't leave with answers. Nobody does. You'll leave with experiences, with stories, with photographs and recordings that might show something or might show nothing. You'll leave with the memory of standing in the darkness, in spaces where terrible things happened, and feeling something, whether it was ghosts or just the weight of history pressing down on you. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the Ohio State Reformatory doesn't need to prove its hauntings conclusively. Maybe it's enough that it preserves memory, that it refuses to let us forget what happened here, that it makes visitors confront the realities of American incarceration, of how we treated people, of what our justice system was and in many ways still is. The haunting, whether literal or metaphorical, serves a purpose. It keeps people coming, keeps them engaged with this history, keeps the building maintained and preserved. Without the ghost stories, without the paranormal reputation, the Ohio State Reformatory would be just another abandoned prison, demolished long ago, its lessons unlearned, its warnings unheeded. As dawn breaks, and you leave the Ohio State Reformatory, walking out the same doors you entered hours earlier, you carry something out with you. Not necessarily proof of ghosts, not definitive evidence of the paranormal, but something more subtle and perhaps more valuable. You carry an understanding, visceral and immediate, of what this place was, what was done here to human beings in the name of justice and rehabilitation. The Ohio State Reformatory stands as a monument to failure, to the failure of the rehabilitative ideal, to the failure of the American prison system to live up to its stated goals of reform and redemption. But it also stands as a monument to resilience, to the fact that buildings, like people, can survive beyond their original purpose, can find new meaning in new contexts. The Reformatory failed as a prison. It's succeeding as a historic site, as a place of remembrance, as a location that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past and our present. The ghosts, if they exist, aren't the story. The story is what created the conditions for ghosts. The story is overcrowding and violence, neglect and cruelty, the grinding despair of incarceration in a system that had given up on its mission of reform. The story is Urban Wilford and Frank Hanger dying in the line of duty. The story is James Lockhart choosing fire over continued existence. The story is Helen Glattke bleeding out in her bedroom. The story is Arthur Glattke dying of a broken heart. The story is 154,000 men passing through these doors, most emerging damaged in ways that would shape the rest of their lives. If you believe in ghosts, the Ohio State Reformatory gives you plenty of opportunities to encounter them. If you don't believe, the Reformatory gives you something equally valuable, a confrontation with documented history, with the real consequences of policy decisions, with the human cost of institutional failure. The footsteps you hear in the corridors after lockdown, whether they're paranormal or acoustic phenomena, represent something real. They represent the presence of the past, the fact that what happened here doesn't simply vanish when we close our eyes or lock the doors. The past persists. It demands to be remembered. And buildings like the Ohio State Reformatory, buildings that witnessed so much suffering and refused to collapse, refused to be demolished, these buildings serve as vehicles for that memory. Perhaps that's the real haunting. Not spirits walking the cell blocks, but memory walking through our consciousness, refusing to let us forget, demanding that we acknowledge what was done, that we consider whether we've really changed, whether the prisons we build today are any better than this Gothic fortress in Mansfield, Ohio. The Ohio State Reformatory waits for you. If you're brave enough, or curious enough, or haunted enough by your own questions to visit. It offers no easy answers, only experiences, only encounters with spaces that hold memory, only the opportunity to stand where others stood, to feel what they felt, to understand, even briefly, what it means when freedom is taken away, when hope dies in darkness, when human beings are reduced to numbers and cells, and an understanding that, even partially, even imperfectly, you honor the memory of everyone who suffered here. The inmates who were reformed, and those who weren't, the guards who died, and those who survived, the families who lost loved ones, the community that both depended on and feared this institution. You honor them by remembering, by refusing to let their stories vanish into the forgotten corners of history. The footsteps continue after lockdown because memory continues, because the past isn't past, because some truths need to be told again and again, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they challenge our assumptions about justice and redemption and the nature of our society. So thank you for walking these halls with me tonight, for exploring the shadows, for listening to the stories that the Ohio State Reformatory still has to tell. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, whether you think the paranormal is real or psychological, I hope you'll remember what this place represents. Not just a tourist attraction or a filming location, but a piece of American history that refused to be erased, that stands as witness to what we've done and what we might do better. Before we conclude our journey tonight, I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this exploration of the Ohio State Correctional Facility. Your curiosity, your willingness to confront these dark histories is what makes this storytelling so valuable. I'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to subscribe to our Mystic Sleep Tales channel so you don't miss a single episode. Leave a comment below to let us know where you're listening from and what time it is in the world. It's fascinating to think of you all scattered across the globe, some falling asleep, some listening on a long journey, or during a quiet afternoon. We are all connected by these stories, by our shared curiosity about the mysteries lurking in the shadows. And if there's a particular mystical story, haunted place, historical mystery you'd like us to explore in a future episode, let us know. Your suggestions guide our journey into the unknown. Perhaps there's a local legend from your hometown, a family story untold to many, or a place you've always wondered about. Share it with us in the comments. Who knows? Your suggestion could be the subject of our next in-depth exploration of the mysteries of sleep time history. Thank you again for being part of the mysterious Sleep Stories community. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that the past is never as far in the past as we think. Until next time, this is your guide to the mysterious realms, wishing you peaceful rest and intriguing dreams. Remember, tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.